Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor McKay, and I'm the Membership Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event featuring former Acting White House Chief of Staff, Mr. Mick Mulvaney. Before we begin, I would like to say a few words about the Buckley program and the format of today's event. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 550 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. For today's event, after introducing our guest, I'll turn things over to him, and after his remarks, we'll open the floor for questions from you, the audience. Now for our speaker. Mr. Mick Mulvaney is co-chair at Actum LLC, a global consultancy designed to solve diverse public and private sector challenges. He previously served as acting White House Chief of Staff from January 2019 until March 2020. Mr. Mulvaney also served as director of the Office of Management and Budget. He was nominated to the post by President Donald J. Trump in December 2016 and was confirmed by the Senate on February 16, 2017. Prior to his time as the director of OMB, he served the people of the 5th District of South Carolina as their congressman, where he was first elected in 2010, and he was the first Republican member to hold that seat in 128 years. So without further ado, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Mick Mulvaney to the Buckley program and to Yale.
Thanks very much. Do you want to move the sign over here? You want to leave it there? I don't know. So there you go. Look, ordinarily, you have people come in and they talk and they say thanks for having me out. I really appreciate this in a way that you don't understand. I'm going to try and help you to understand. I've been out of government now for 2.5 years. I quit on the night of January 6th. I've been out of the White House for 3.5 years. Okay? This is the first university to invite me to come and speak to the students. The first one. I can't think of another person who's been in Congress. By the way, I founded the Freedom Caucus, I was the budget director, was a financial regulator. I ran the CFPB for a year. I was the chief of staff for 15 months. And I can't get my own alma mater to let me come on campus. In fact, there was a petition to keep me and other Trump people off of the Georgetown University campus. When the rankings came out, I'm sure you're familiar with them in the last couple of weeks. Y'all didn't do great. I think you were 14th worst in terms of the atmosphere for free speech. My business school at Harvard was the single worst. Georgetown was the 4th worst, and the school that's down the street from my house, where I used to help appoint the members of the Board of Regents, Board of Directors at the University of South Carolina, was in the state legislature, was the 3rd worst. So it's really depressing. But I'm glad I'm here. By the way, I've been to Oxford once, Cambridge twice. I've spoken in Vienna, I've spoken in Lisbon, I've spoken at Rome. For some reason, American universities don't want to have conservatives come and talk on campus, and that's extraordinarily worrisome and problematic. I'm not going to talk a lot. I don't even have anything prepared. What notes I have are all the way over there in my jacket, and I can't see them from here. So mostly what I want to do is get to your questions, but I do want to talk a little bit first about some of the experiences I've had in the last 2 years. And by the way, they do involve students. They don't involve being invited to campus because, again, I can't get invited to campus. But there's a couple of stories that I do want to share with you to start the afternoon. When I speak to business groups, I speak to a lot of CEO groups, I speak to a lot of corporate groups, and because I was the chief of staff and because I was the budget director especially, I get asked a fairly regular question. What keeps you up at night? Okay? And when you used to write the budget, and you understand the deficit, you understand math, my background's in economics, certainly there's a lot about the fiscal situation in this country that can and should keep one up at night. When you're on the White House Chief of Staff, you also get the Presidential Daily Briefing, you get the international threat assessments every single day. And when you start your day, literally every day, for an hour, learning how close the world is to ending sometimes, there's a lot of things that could keep you up at night. That's not what keeps me up at night. I have 2 stories about talking to student groups that keep me up at night. Both of them involve high achieving universities in Southern California, UCLA, USC. Frank Luntz is a friend of mine. You may know of Dr. Luntz. He's on TV from time to time. He was just texting me, as a matter of fact. I'm speaking to a group of his in Washington, D.C. We tried to put together a program on civil discourse to take to a major university. We took it to Georgetown, AMU, GW, USC, and UCLA, and none of them would have us. So what Frank decided to do instead is do it privately, and he has groups come to his home, and he has members of Congress, elected officials, corporate leaders, and so forth come into his house to speak to groups about this size. And I've done this a dozen times. I'm doing it again in Washington next week. And the 2 stories I want to tell you come from that experience. Number 1, I'm in Frank's house talking about the press conference that I gave during the first impeachment. And John Carl was there. John Carl's another friend of mine. He's a friend of Frank's. He's the ABC television reporter. At the time of the first impeachment, he was the president of the White House Correspondents Association, which meant that he was typically the first person who got the questions at the briefing. And I gave a briefing one day, and John was sitting right there, and he asked me about a quid pro quo. If you follow that at all, he and I went back and forth. And Frank played the tape of that, and then I told the young people what I meant, and John Carl told the people what I really meant. That's an interesting conversation to have. When you're telling people what you meant and someone else is telling you, no, what he really meant to say was this. But anyway, so John and I, as we have many times, got into it. I told John what an idiot I thought he was, and he told me what a liar I thought I was. And we've done this before. At the end of the presentation, John had to leave. And I was stuck around for a while afterwards, was talking to the students, and a young woman came up to ask me, she goes, can I ask you a personal question? I'm like, yeah, what? She goes, are you and that man friends? I'm like, yeah. And she goes, really? And I could tell this was a big, I thought it was a throwaway question, but you could tell, no, it was a serious question. I'm like, yeah, let me think this through. Yeah, John and I, we go to dinner together, we go to baseball games together, our kids go to school together at University of Virginia, we've seen each other there. Yes, I would consider John Carl to be a friend of mine. Why do you ask? He says, well, it seems like you disagree on a lot of things. I said, yeah, we do, because he's wrong most of the time. And I said, why does that strike you as unusual? She goes, well, I just could never be friends with somebody I disagree with. And I looked at her, and I didn't want to overreact, because she was deadly serious. And I knew her from the interaction. I'd been there for about an hour and a half. And I knew from the interaction in the class that there were folks left of center, folks in the center, folks right of center in the group. Again, the group's about this size. And I could tell that she was having conversations with folks who disagreed with her on politics. And I said, what about you and that guy that you were sitting next to? You seemed like you got along. She goes, oh, we get along fine. I would never be seen with him in public. He's a Republican. And we laugh, but again, this was deadly serious. I had never heard that before. When I was a young person, I didn't know, my wife and I didn't talk politics till a long time after my children were born. I'm not sure my parents ever talked politics with me when I was a kid. It was not something that came up in conversation. You had friends first, and then they might be Democrat, they might be Republican, they might be progressive, might be liberal, you never know. In fact, I don't know what most of my friends were from high school and college. It's interesting. After you join the Trump administration, you typically find out what their affiliation is. But that was stunning to me. And then I marry it with another story from a similar group a few weeks later. We were at Frank's house in Los Angeles. And the topic that night wasn't politics, it was local policing. He wanted to do a focus group. That's how Frank made his name for himself, and he does it with the students, on the LAPD. They'd have a couple of very high-profile difficulties. And what he likes to do is like to start a group like this, and he'll walk around and he said, now, when I say Los Angeles Police Department, what's the first word that comes into your mind? Again, these are the honor scholars at UCLA and USC, so they're all local, or at least they're going to school local, even if they're someplace else. And he got a couple answers that are worthless, and or not worthless, but not very interesting. One young man says, racist, and he goes, okay, now why do you say that? And the young man took it very seriously, a very serious group of folks, and he says, well, a couple of things. We all know that the Los Angeles Police Department was created for the specific purpose of returning escaped slaves to their masters. And they've never been able to sort of atone for, cleanse themselves of that original sin. And that racism has been in their DNA from their very founding. And you could see it just last week when we all saw that they shot an unarmed black man 62 times down in Compton. You cannot do that to another human being if there's not something about you institutionally that is racist. Okay? Very, very compelling presentation, the young man said. Now, he knew that the guy sitting next to him was the chief of police. And Frank said, now, Chief, you've just heard that. What's your response? And very respectfully, the chief, who, by the way, is from Compton, came up from some of the worst neighborhoods in Los Angeles, said, Frank, I get it. all I can say is this. Number one, it is not possible for us to have been created for the purpose of returning escaped slaves to their masters, because we were not created until 1868. Okay? So that is factually impossible to be true. Number two, I saw the stuff on the internet about the incident last week. It was really, really nasty. Yes, we did shoot this guy. We shot the guy. Didn't shoot him 62 times. We shot him about 24 times, which is a lot. But the supposedly unarmed guy shot at my people 18 times. All I'm telling you is that everything you've just heard is false. And Frank turns back to the young man and says, young man, how do you respond to that? And the kid says, I don't care. We all know you're racist anyway. The single most frightening sentence I have heard in the last 5 years, and think about some of the sentences that I have probably heard in the last 5 years. I don't care. We all know you're racist anyway. When presented with facts, provable facts, the answer was, I don't care. That's what worries me. Here's why. Because I do know all the other problems the country faces. I understand the fiscal situation. I know what $32 trillion in debt means in ways that really should keep me up at night. I understand what the oncoming Social Security problem is going to be. I understand what a lot of the international challenges are, or at least were when I was in the White House. We are never going to be able to deal with those with that mentality in this generation. If you cannot be friends with people you disagree with, if you can't even talk to people you disagree with, if you don't care what the facts are, but you know that you are right regardless of what the facts are, then we are really in a lot of trouble. This country has a strong history. One of the reasons the country has survived as long as it has is because of its ability to compromise. The whole reason we have a House and a Senate, the reason we have a Washington, D.C., where it is. We've been able to compromise over the course of the last 240-odd years. If you cannot talk to somebody who disagrees with you, if you do not believe a word that they say, how are you ever going to be able to compromise with them, and how are you going to be able to lead this nation? The reason I'm glad to come to Yale is my guess is there's a lot of future leaders in this class. I could go to the University of South Carolina at Salkehatchie and talk to a group this same size, but my guess is there's not very many congressmen and senators and CEOs in that group. Okay? There is at Yale. So if I can get that message through to you folks, I might have accomplished something. Because if that's the attitude, if that's what I saw at USC and UCLA is pervasive, and I fear that it might be, when I see Harvard, as again, place I went to school, as supposedly the best university on campus in the country. I know I'd probably get some pushback here or there on that. As the single worst place for free speech. How can those two things possibly be true? How can you be the best university in the country and the worst at free speech? How can you folks supposedly be the second or third, depending on what list you look at, and the fourth worst at free speech? One of the advantages that the folks at the University of Alabama have over you is at least they know what the other side is thinking. You probably get it here because you're conservative. You know what your liberal friends are thinking because all you have to do is watch CNN or read the New York Times. But there's a large percentage of people on this campus who have no idea what you are thinking. No idea why you're thinking what you're thinking. All they care about me is that I'm a Republican, therefore I must be a white supremacist racist. Okay? Woman-hating abortionist or anti-abortionist. If you're not listening to what the other side has to say, how can you function in a complex society like we have? So that's why I'm here, is to hopefully encourage you to do what you're doing. And I was sort of hoping that there'd be more folks here who don't see things the way that I do. I was hoping there'd be, I would love to talk to progressive groups. I don't get that chance, by the way. I don't get that chance before I get finished knocking academia. I will knock the corporate world as well. A friend of mine works at State Street Bank. People always get upset when I name names, but that's what I do. A buddy of mine called me from State Street Bank and said, we'd like you to come talk to our annual shareholders meeting. I said, that'd be great. He said, but we want to have some balance. Could you bring a Democrat friend? I'm like, I know just the guy. I called Joe Kennedy. Joe's in Congress with me. He's one of those Kennedys. He had just lost his Senate race in Massachusetts. Joe is now the special envoy to Northern Ireland, which was, I was previously in that position. Joe and I are good friends. Joe lives in Boston, would love to do it. I called my friend back at State Street Bank. I said, I got a Democrat. I got Joe Kennedy. He goes, what do you want to talk about? He said, we want to talk about civil discourse, about disagreeing without being disagreeable. Joe and I disagree on about 90% of policies, but we want to prove to people that folks who disagree can still be friends and still have a fair and honest discussion about things. They called back a week later and said, thank you, but no thank you. That's too controversial for us. We can't do that. That's where you're going to work at some point in the future. So it's a very interesting time. I never thought I'd see the time when academia was the worst place in the country for free speech, but apparently that's where it comes down to. But corporations are not far behind. I don't have any, that's all I got. You want to ask questions? You want to ask your own questions? I'll do whatever. So
Perhaps some questions from the audience. Just raise your hand. I'll hand the mic to you. If you could introduce yourself, and we'll go from there. Yeah, up here.
Hi, my name's Abhi. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee,
Yeah.
and I'm as liberal as they get. But I'm actually like a huge fan of free speech, and I sort of think that Yale does have a long way to go. But my problem is like, why are we framing this solely as like a liberal problem? I mean, if you look at like academia in the South, for example, if you look at public schools in the South, books are being banned. You can't talk about certain topics, certain racial topics. Why is this only a liberal issue?
it's not an only liberal issue. I think that it's, and I wish I had a slide, and I thought about it in the train on the way up here. I work for a company called News Nation. It's a new media outlet. It's the old WGN America, if you're familiar with that. And they're trying to go right down the middle. And there was actually a report out in the last couple of weeks that showed that we were the one media that was actually right down the middle in terms of bias left or right. But if you look at the spread, this is a group out of Colorado that does this, over on the right, you have exactly what I would expect you would see, okay, which is you've got the Wall Street Journal, you've got Fox Business, and then way over on the fringe, you've got Alex Jones and the other nut jobs, right? On the left of center, ABC, NBC, CBS, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, PBS, NPR, everything. It's a balance issue. It's a volume issue. Is the reason that I couch it in that terms. Academia has been for a long time a liberal bastion. Now, it was a liberal bastion with a heavy accent on freedom of speech, but that has changed. Look, some of you mentioned to me that you've met or know of Dr. Michael Oslin. Dr. Oslin used to teach. He's my roommate in college. Okay? He's now at Hoover. Left here because he did not feel comfortable as a conservative faculty member. Did not feel that he had the ability to advance. If you go look at the detail on the rankings that just came out, you're looking at me like I'm from another planet. By the way, another reason that it's hard to have a conversation with. Did I look at you like that when you asked me the question?
I was just like, that wasn't the question I had asked, sort of. Like, my question is like sort of about like the public schools and like the high school.
You asked me about, okay, let's talk about book banning and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. And I've not had a chance to, Ron DeSantis and I were in Congress together, and I don't understand some of the issues. I understand a piece of it, because I live right on the North Carolina-South Carolina border, okay? And sometimes what gets presented to us in the press is not exactly right. Again, go back to the bias, left and right. Fox News is just as biased as MSNBC. In North Carolina, the restriction is very simple. You can't do it to kids younger than the 4th grade. You cannot teach sexual orientation to kids below the 4th grade. That's a decision that the state legislature made. It doesn't mean that they're banning books and, from libraries across the academic system. They're doing it for the younger kids. Is that shutting off the debate when second-year-olds can't talk about it? I don't know if that's the case or not. But you asked a fair question, which is why is it perceived as a progressive thing? It's a volume issue. And every conservative in this room knows what liberals are thinking and why they're thinking it. Very few liberals in whatever the group is next door understand what these folks in here are thinking or why they're thinking it, unless they're watching Fox, which is unlikely. By the way, I don't watch Fox.
Perhaps another question.
Don't tell Trey Gowdy, he's a friend of mine with Sunday Night Show. But
Okay. Hi. I had a question, kind of like, I think when you're framing it, you're talking a lot about like among equals, kind of being able to discourse with someone across the aisle. But I think a lot of times in like an institution like Yale, that's not the case. It's like coming from professors, for example, who, if you take a class in a more humanities class that you can feel is being graded subjectively, or even like how you're going to be treated in the classroom is more subjective, like how do you approach that when it's like in the lecture itself, the material being taught to you itself, you feel like is biased?
where's the young man who asked, you asked me this question, a similar question on the podcast, and I think I gave you an answer that surprised you, which is you shouldn't really give a shit, okay? And here's why. My son went off to law school at Chapel Hill, and the guy who's the dean actually is a friend of mine when I was there. And he gave a fabulous presentation the first day. He said, please, please, please stop caring about grades. You're already here. Okay? No one is going to ask you from here on out what your grades were. They're going to ask you, they're going to judge you by what you bring into an interview, what you bring to an internship, what you can bring to an organization. They're not going to say, did you make a C+ in that class or did you make an A-? Maybe if you want to go to grad school, it comes up, but they probably look at your test scores more than your grade scores. You shouldn't care. I would encourage you never to change an answer in a class in order to tell the teacher what they want to hear from a philosophical standpoint. If it's a factual standpoint, if you know the teacher says there's 10 things from Egyptian history that I need to know, that's a different story, right? But if it's a philosophical thing, if it's an opinion thing, I would encourage you never to give it on something like that. That's just, it doesn't make that big a difference anymore. You're here. You're already successful. Whether or not the professor likes you or you get a decent grade in that class is probably secondary at this point. Yeah. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and see, that's the difference between what you're being taught and what I was being taught. When I was in law school and took con law, I never had a teacher tell me, with the possible exception of some of the slavery cases from the 19th century, to say, this case was wrong. Okay? What they said was, here was the argument on one side, and here was the argument on the other, and here's where the court came down on it. Okay? Listen, I think you're already ahead of the game by being able to identify it. I couldn't. Look, this is not easy to talk about in today and age, but I learned the Civil War very differently than you folks did. Okay? My wife learned it especially differently than you did. My wife is 5 years old, and I am. She grew up in a rural part of North Carolina. I grew up in the city of Charlotte in a Catholic school about 5 years after. I learned it as the war between the states. Okay? That was the title of the chapter in my U.S. history book in 6th grade when we took American history, right? The war between the states. My wife learned it as the war of northern aggression. It's not an exaggeration. Okay? In fact, when I was doing some thinking and doing some research for this particular class, for tonight, what I'm talking about tonight, there's a very famous television series called The Civil War by Ken Burns. Very powerful stuff. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to watch it. It became relevant in the Trump administration, believe it or not, for the most bizarre reason. For some reason, John Kelly, my predecessor and a chief of staff and a really decent man and a Gold Star parent and a 4-star general and just a great American, really bad on television, decided to have a conversation at the press conference about the Civil War. I have no idea why he did that. Okay? And one of the things he said was, well, one of the causes of the, well, I think it might have been after Charlottesville. He said that, one of the primary cause of civil war is the failure to compromise, and was absolutely excoriated for that comment. And I remember that comment because I had seen that comment before. It's the opening scene of the Ken Burns special, where they're interviewing a very prominent Southern guy from University of North Carolina, the guy who wrote the 3-volume set on the Civil War that is generally perceived as one of the greatest works on the Civil War. It's called The Civil War by Shelby Foote. And his opening line is, he says, the war was really caused by our lack of ability to compromise. It's what we have a genius for in this country. The country's actually built upon it. You've heard me say a little bit about that in my comments before, but I didn't reference it because now that you asked the specific question. That line itself has come under a great deal of criticism, okay, from other academics in the subsequent 30 years since that program came out. And I get that. Does it diminish the role of slavery in the Civil War? Does it romanticize the South, etc.? I think that's a fair conversation to have. That's different, I think, than what you are saying. When someone says, that's wrong and this is right. I welcome the debate about different opinions and different sides of things. I think we're healthier for it and better for it. I'd never had a teacher that I can remember walk in and tell me, this case was decided wrongly, with the possible addition of, again, Plessy versus Ferguson. So it's unfortunate that you're getting that. But again, you're probably ahead of the game because you can identify it. And I was not smart enough to do that when I was 20 years old.
Hi, I'm Ethan, a first year. You've talked about compromise, about civil discourse,
Yeah.
and thoughtful debate. So I'd like to ask about your own House Freedom Caucus
Yeah.
on those fronts. Do you think they're good at those things? And what do
No.
you think of what they've done recently, particularly with respect to the selection of the current speaker and also debates about the debt ceiling and their approach and what it's doing to the institution of the House?
The difficulty with the word compromise right now in Washington, D.C. is that it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Okay? Compromise in Washington, D.C., when Matt Gaetz tells you he wants the Democrats to compromise, what he means is, I want them to agree with me. When Nancy Pelosi says, I think the Republicans need to compromise, she means, I want them to agree with me. No one compromises in Washington, D.C. Look back at the major pieces of legislation in your lifetime. Okay, in the last 5 years, we had the Affordable Care Act. Not a single Republican voted for it. You had the Trump tax cuts. Not a single Democrat voted for it. You had the Inflation Reduction Act. Not a single Republican voted for it. We've lost that ability to compromise, and I think that is a major difficulty. Again, one of the reasons I'm counting on your generation to fix it is that we've managed to screw it up. By the way, the original working title of the House Freedom Caucus, which I did help found with 8 other folks, was the Reasonable Nutjob Caucus. That's God's honest truth. And what we decided was we needed to have folks who were hardcore right-wing conservatives who had the ability to actually compromise, to give and to take, okay, strategically to do that. And for that reason, there were people that we deemed to be too crazy to be in that group. Louis Gohmert was not allowed to be in our group. Okay, I don't know if you know who that is. He's a congressman from Texas. Steve King, the guy from Iowa, too crazy to be in our group. There are several people who are in that group today that I would never have voted to allow into the group for that exact same reason. We were never designed to be the crazies on the right-hand side. We were designed to be the folks on the right-hand side who could pick their spots to cut deals in order to move the ball in our direction a little bit. So I think they've done a miserable job. What they found out is they can make a lot of money and get very famous very quickly. They have raised a tremendous amount of money. Several of them are now talking about running for governors and senators. They're on Fox News every single night. There is a great deal of money and a great deal of fame to come from outrage under the current system. Come back to the point about the media, right? When you have so much money made at the MSNBCs and the Fox businesses, that's where people are going to go, okay? I can have people on News Nation all night. We're a brand new sort of network, but there's 100,000 people watching us. There's 5 million people watching Rachel Maddow. There's 4.5 million people watching Sean Hannity. There's money to be made on the outside, and I think that is a real problem. As to the speakership, I just had Dan Bishop is a friend of mine. I talked to Dan the other day. He and I went to law school together. He's a member of the Freedom Caucus. And he asked me why I didn't support the Freedom Caucus in the thing to elect Kevin Speaker and again on the debt ceiling. And I said, that's pretty simple. I said, you guys didn't have a plan B on the speaker. You know, and just being able to prevent somebody from being speaker doesn't solve a problem. And I never thought I thought you were playing checkers, not chess. On the debt ceiling, I don't know what that is. I don't know what the economy looks like when you breach the debt ceiling because we've never done it. So you're gambling with an unknown. Now, on the government funding bill, which is coming up now, that's a different story. I know exactly what that looks like. I managed the longest government shutdown in history in 2019. Okay, government shutdowns are no big deal. 15% of the government stops working. Okay, this is a knowable thing. This is where you should actually dig your heels in and fight because the downside risk is so low. You're not gambling with the whole institution by not having a speaker. Keep in mind, Congress can't do anything without a speaker. They can't vote on anything. Okay? And you're not gambling with the debt ceiling, but no one knows what that means. Okay? Can you prioritize? I think you can, but we've never done it. Now you're moving into the realm where you know a little bit of the environment, and now's a good time to have a battle. That's the sort of analysis that I don't think the Freedom Caucus is doing right now. They are crazy all of the time, and I think that they've lost. By the way, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that because I violated one of my own rules. It was never a Freedom Caucus opposition to Kevin. Freedom Caucus at any one time was about 40 members. Only 15 were voting against Kevin, which meant 25 were voting for him. Okay? And that's the same right now. So there's actually this rump group within the Freedom Caucus that is using the Freedom Caucus name because it's a brand, but it's not. We used to have, in order for the Freedom Caucus to take a formal position on anything, we had to have an 80% approval of the membership. Okay? And if you lost that, if you were in the 20% that voted against the 80%, but the group got 80%, you had to vote with the group unless you had a really, really good reason to do it. That was the whole concept of the caucus. I know that because I wrote the rules, okay? And that has gone now by the wayside a long time ago. It's more details than you guys probably wanted, I'm sorry.
Oh, my name is Zachary Pan. I'm also a freshman, and I'm also pretty progressive, but I do agree.
Now, are you guys freshmen or first years, or that doesn't make a difference here?
First year is freshman.
Okay.
I'm not sure what you had said.
Because my son went to Virginia, and God forbid you ever call them freshmen. It was, oh, that was first year, or else he wouldn't come to the dinner table. So, yeah.
Well, that being said, so I do agree that there are issues that sort of transcend partisanship, free speech being one of them, but I
Yeah.
also think democracy is also one of those issues that transcends partisanship. You did resign after Donald Trump supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol, which is in its own sense a stance on the democracy issue. I was wondering, would you maintain that stance in a Biden versus Trump matchup, considering the riot at the Capitol, your decision to resign then? Who would you support between Biden and Trump?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two answers to the question. I'm going to give you the answer you don't want to hear, and then I'll sort of give you some hints at the answer you want to hear. Okay, the first answer is, anybody ever ask you who you're voting for? Tell them it's none of their goddamn business. Okay? Because it's not. It's not. There's a reason we go into the curtain and close it, right? So I have the right to tell you it's none of your business, but I also recognize the fact that I'm up here and I'm a public figure and I get it. So, but if you ever ask anybody else and they tell you it's none of your business, you should respect that, because you can ask, but the person doesn't have to answer. I'm not a big Donald Trump fan. I'm not. I've told him that. I think he's going to lose anyway. I think he's going to win the Republican nomination and lose anyway. I don't think he could beat Joe Biden. I think any Republican could beat Joe Biden except Donald Trump. Do I think he's got a chance to win? Yeah, but I handicap it at about 4-1 against. 80% chance of losing, 20% chance of winning. I'm not going to be working for him. Someone asked me the other day if I would go back to work for him. In fact, I just got a text from somebody today asking me if I wanted to kiss and make up with the president. I very politely declined. The president and I have a very interesting relationship. Chiefs of staff and the presidents are pretty close. We were never friendly. I was never going to be friends with Donald Trump, and I knew that. I never expected to be his friend. Didn't want to be his friend. If you're a good chief of staff. So one day I go in there late at night. I used to work every day from about 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. at night, and I had another team that would come in at noon and work to 2, because the president only slept about 4 hours a night. And I told him, I said, look, I can't work those hours. Nobody can. He said, that's fine as long as you got some coverage. So I go in about 8 o'clock at the end of the day, and I'm like, look, boss, we got some shit to deal with. Pelosi's not coming tomorrow because of something tweet you put out. The 2 senators are not coming tomorrow because the Senate wrapped up early and they're going back to a fundraiser. The secretary so-and-so and secretary so-and-so refused to sit next to each other on the dais at the presentation in Florida on Thursday because they're fighting over some regulation. Secret Service is having a credible threat against one of your kids, so we're going to have to raise the protection level for a little bit. And the fence around the building is going to be 6 months late and $50 million over budget. And he looks at me and goes, Mick, what exactly do you do around here? And I said, Mr. President, I do all the shit you don't want to do, and I'll tell you all the shit you don't want to hear. And that's the job of a chief of staff. And you can't do that with being his friend. So he and I were never friendly. Okay? We respected each other and are friends. Now, I don't say very, very bad things about him in public, and he doesn't say very, very bad things about me in public. One time, about 3 months ago, he put out a tweet that said I was a born loser. I responded that I put out the number 4. Do you know what that means? That's the number of times that he hired me. Okay? He hired me to be the budget director, hired me to be the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau guy, hired me to be chief of staff, and hired me to be the special envoy in Northern Ireland. And miraculously, the discussion stopped after that. So that's sort of where he and I are. And I will not be supporting him in 2024. I'm good friends, by the way, with everybody else. Tim Scott and I served together in the state legislature. I sat next to Nikki Haley for 2 years in the state floor in South Carolina. Ron DeSantis and I served together. Mike Pence and I served together. I had the most fascinating conversation with Chris Christie right before he started to run. I wish I could share you some of that, but a lot of that is private. I know, in fact, I think Vivek Ramaswamy is the only one I don't know personally who's on that stage.
Thank you. My name is Audrey Kamina. I'm from San Francisco, California. And my question for you is, what went wrong? Freedom of speech used to be the one freedom that we, Republican or Democrat, lauded above all. And even if I didn't agree with what you had to say, I would die to defend it. And so what changed? And are we doomed?
I'm going to give you a practical answer, then I'm going to give you a really cynical answer. And my cynical answer is going to upset any progressives in here, but I'd be happy to talk about it. The practical answer is money. Practical answer is that we figured out that there's a lot of money to be made by not being fair and balanced. By the way, a term that Fox News no longer uses as far as I can tell. That people just discovered that there's no market down the middle. The country, people ask, why is Washington so broken? Washington's not broken. The country's broken. It's a representative democracy. There is no evil hand that comes down and picks Marjorie Taylor Greene and says, you are going to Congress. Or comes down and says to AOC, you are going to Congress. The people in those districts look at their choices and say, that is the person who I think best could represent me in Washington, D.C. The country is broken. How did the country get broken? A couple different ways. Media split, because they found out there was more money in that. We stopped sharing. I was talking to you about my Camino, that I just took the Camino of Santiago, and one of the reasons I could talk to complete strangers at the end of every day after walking 15 miles with a 20-pound pack was that they had just done the same thing. And even though they were from 6 different countries and were 6 different languages and were trying to figure out how to talk to each other, we had a shared experience. We don't share the same experiences. My daughter has the exact same degree at Georgetown University than I have. The exact same one. She took 2 of the same classes I did. The exact same certificate on her diploma. Okay, 2 classes the same. That shared sort of background. Ben Sass gives an interesting speech on this. In fact, I've heard it so many times I got tired of hearing it, but it's not wrong. And it's got all sort of holes you can poke in it, but there's a certain kernel of truth to it, which in 1965, 65% of the country watched the same television program on Sunday night. And when they went to work on Monday, whether or not they were male, female, black, red, white, whatever, they had some shared experience from the previous night that you could talk about. We don't even do that. By the way, we don't even have that anymore. It's a wonderful book by a guy who I think used to work at Heritage called Coming Apart. Charles Taylor, I think is his name. And he tells a story about an example of how America used to be and how it is now, especially when it comes to classes. By the way, all of his research isolated for race. So he just studied white groups. There's no racial component to this analysis I'm getting ready to give to you. He said, look, 30 years ago, okay, the CEO of a corporation, okay, probably lived in the same neighborhood as his middle managers. Okay? Lived in a nicer house, but lived in the same neighborhood. The kids probably went to the same school. They probably went to the same beach for summer vacation. Now, the boss had the waterfront property, and the middle manager probably had something 3 rows back, but they all hung out together, and they absolutely all went to church together. Okay? By the way, that was the case with my dad. My dad was a middle manager, and I remember the CEO of his the owner of his company, big company, lived around the corner from us. Big house. We lived in a little townhome. Okay? This happened to us. Today, I want you to stop to think about that. Pick any corporation that you know the name of. Apple Computer. Do you think Tim Cook lives in the same neighborhood as his middle managers? Do you think his kids go to the same school? You think they go to the same churches? Do you think they go to the same place on vacation? There's no way that's happening. So the country is coming apart, and that's the name of the book. I encourage you to take a look at it. I'm going to give you the cynical answer to it. And there's this is going to go over like a, well, anyway. I absolutely believe that when people lose, they like to change the rules instead of get better. I've seen it 100 times. And sometimes if you're losing a game, the best way to change that outcome, instead of getting better at what you do, is to change the rules. And I certainly think I see that in corporate America. I think I see that in academia. I think I see that in a bunch of different places. So I think that my progressive friends are saying, look, we couldn't win in a meritocracy, so let's get rid of a meritocracy. What are we talking now about in terms of corporations? We're talking about the ESG movement. It used to be that you talk about profits, okay, and that was measurable. That was a meritocracy. That was an objective type of thing. Now we talk about ESG. Why? Because the rules are different. And if you're a progressive, you can do a lot better in an ESG environment than you can in a purely capitalist environment. So that's my cynical answer to your question. Are we doomed? No, I don't. As long as it doesn't go on too long, I don't think that we are. The country has a history of doing this, right? So the problem is sometimes when we do this, we go too far. We did that one time in 1861, right? But I mean, I remember we had race riots in Washington, D.C. when I was born. I'm sure they thought the country was ending then, and it didn't. We had very difficult times in the 1980s, or late 1970s economically, and I'm sure thought the country was coming apart. In the 1920s, I know they thought the country was going to rip itself apart. You can read the academic history on that, and they were worried about the republic failing. Unemployment was 25% in 1929, 1930. So we've had difficulties before, but we've been able to figure it out. I worry now that we don't have the ability to figure it out. I'm not sure my generation has time to figure it out. I'm hoping that yours does.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a senior studying history. And what was the transition like for you from Congress to leading OMB, leading CFPB, working in the White House? And additionally, I'd be interested in hearing any funny anecdotes that you could share, additional funny anecdotes from your time in the Trump administration.
The one about him asking me what I do was not funny enough. Is that what you're saying? I want more. It's not a very interesting answer to your first question. Congress is a very flat organization, and I didn't have a boss. I had 750,000 bosses back in the 5th District of South Carolina, only about 100,000 of whom voted, but that's okay. And so it was a very flat organization. It was a very collegial organization. It was a great, I enjoyed it. One of my favorite jobs ever. The gymnasium was actually my favorite place to go. It's the last place where there's actually true bipartisanship. My row was Joe, at the lockers, was Joe Kennedy, who's now the special envoy, Alex Mooney, who's running for Senate from West Virginia, Tim Walz, who is the governor of Minnesota, myself, and then Peter Welch, who is now the senator from Vermont. So that's just, I would never have met that group of folks. By the way, the reason it's all men is it was the men's locker room. So Tulsi Gabbard was in our workout group, and my spin mistress in spin class, Kirsten Sinema, one of the nastiest people I've ever met on a bicycle. The woman is just brutal. All she did was curse at me all morning. It was just terrible, in words I would never use in public again. So, but she's a tremendous athlete. For those who don't know about her, she's an Ironman, an Iron Lady. She does actual Ironman triathlons, and she's in tremendous shape. So that was a great experience there. So it was a very collegial. I go over to OMB, and I have one boss, and I have 500 people working for me. I go over to CFPB, and I have no boss, and 1,700 people working for me. I go in, and I'm the chief of staff. I have one boss again, and I've got 2,500 people working for me. It's a very vertical type of situation. I'll give you an unsolicited piece of advice, and the reason I went back to business school when I was 30 or something like that was my company's owner came to me and said, "I want you to go back to school." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're too stupid to do anything." I said, "No." He said, "Because you don't have a good peer group." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, as you move up in an organization, there'll be fewer and fewer people around who can actually tell you the truth. And you need to have people around you all the time who consider you to be somewhat of a peer, because it's the only way that someone has the guts to tell you you're full of shit. Okay? And Congress is like that, because you're all a peer group. You've got that right now. I encourage you to maintain that as you get older, to always surround yourself with people who consider themselves to be peers with you, you consider yourself to be peers with them, and that you have a close enough relationship with them to where if you say something stupid or do something stupid, they can look at you and say, "That's pretty stupid." And not only does it not ruin the relationship, you believe them. Okay? That's absolutely, absolutely critical. That I was able to maintain that when I went over to OMB in the executive and had that very sort of vertical integration, just because that's my management style. But a lot of people didn't. I think it's one of Donald Trump's shortcomings. I think Donald Trump got tired of people being around him who were telling him what he didn't want to hear. There's two most disturbing things I've read about the January 6 riots, and they would never register on anybody's radar, probably other than me and the other 20 chiefs of staff. Two comments that Mark Meadows made, or that were made about Mark Meadows. Number one, there was testimony just a couple weeks ago they released the transcript of his testimony of his motion to move his case to federal court. And they asked him, so why did you help create the alternative? I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but the sentiment is right. Why did you help create the alternative slate of electors? And he said, well, because I knew if I didn't and we needed it, I'd get yelled at. And they said, yelled at by who? He said, yelled at by the President of the United States. For a chief of staff to be afraid of doing something or not doing something because you can get yelled at is a really, really bad position for the chief of staff and for the president. In fact, that is a complete breakdown in the system. And it's the second one I know about, because the other piece of evidence came out during Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony on January 6th. And again, Cassidy used to work for me. I didn't know her well, but she used to work for me in the White House. And she said on the day that when Trump got after the January 6th rally and got in the car, the testimony was that he said to the Secret Service, let's go to the Capitol. And they said, well, we can't do that. And he said, no, Mark told me I could, or something to that effect. This was the chief of staff being afraid to tell the president again what he did want to hear. That is a real problem when it comes to any organization. But you can see what happens when you have that breakdown in the highest office in the land. So neither of those are funny anecdotes, but hopefully they're interesting.
My name's Bob. I'm an alum.
Hi, Bob.
Follow-up question, without getting into personalities exactly. Did President Trump consider anybody his peer, either in this country or overseas?
That's a really good question. He did have a group that he would. Let me answer it this way. There were times, not very many, a couple of times where I would have to go to him, close the door, and say, "Boss, we have a problem with this." And when I did that, and it was infrequently, he would listen to me. I could think of 3 or 4 times, but only 3 or 4 times. Typically what happened was that if we thought we saw him going down the wrong decision trail, it was an effort to corral a group of people that we knew he looked to collectively. Television personalities, other elected officials, friends of his from the corporate world, maybe some family members, but not always, depending on the issue. And if he said, "Mick, I want to do X," I couldn't go to him and say, "Mr. President, that's the dumbest idea I think I've ever heard. We have to do Y. Why would you ever think of doing X?" That would never work, okay? If I would call Sean Hannity and say, "Sean, President's thinking of doing X," and Sean, "Why? Why don't we do Y?" I think that's, "Why don't you mention that on your show tonight?" I'd call Kevin McCarthy and say, "We're thinking of doing X. That's a stupid idea. Why don't you call the President and let him know?" Okay? Carl Icahn, same thing. Bob Kraft, whatever, whoever, I don't have any specific examples, but if enough people called him, then the magic of management happens, and now it's his idea. Okay? And that's, by the way, don't laugh at that. That's one of the most powerful things you can do in life, is to convince people that whatever you want them to do is their idea. Okay? It's basic sales 101. It's not my idea that you buy this product, it's your idea. You want to buy this product, right? And so that's what we did. So did he have a peer group? Yeah. Did he have any one person that he would turn to, like I would? I mean, if I have a question about something, I have 6 or 8 or 10 people I can call, and I will respect their opinions. He did it sort of, I used to call, you're old enough to remember the UNLV basketball team from the 1990s with Jerry Tarkanian. They used to play the amoeba defense. It wasn't man-to-man, it wasn't zone, it was just sort of this amorphous group that moved to do whatever it had to around the basketball. That's what we did, and that's how we managed the White House.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a senior at Yale College. So the question I have for you, since you're at OMB, during the time when we had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican White House, why, after 8 years of President Obama, Republicans were talking about reining in spending? It was one of the top issues in the 2012 election. Why, when Republicans get total control of government, do they increase spending, non-defense discretionary spending? But they did it with George W. Bush. They did it with Trump. How will we get to a point where we're actually cutting spending?
I think you and I would be really good friends. So there's a variety of answers to that, because I had that exact same conversation with pieces of that verbatim in the Oval Office with the president. Again, I wasn't chief of staff at the time. I was the OMB director at the time. I could give you a lot of answers in no particular order. Republicans like spending money as much as Democrats do. They just like spending it on other things, is part of the answer. It's really hard to tell people no, is another part of the answer. It just is. It's always easier when people come in to ask you for stuff in Congress, because it's not your money, it's always easier to say yes. They came in to ask you to give it to you out of your pocket. You say, "No, I have other things to do with this money. I'm really sorry." But when it's not your money, it's easy to give it away. It's easier to say yes. And that's part of the philosophy of Washington, D.C. Part of Washington, D.C. is set up hardwired to spend more money one year than it did on the previous year. So the default position is always spending more money. You have to be more aggressive against spending than you are on raising spending, because, again, it defaults towards spending. But the one I will tell you that you probably wouldn't remember, that you wouldn't realize happens, because no one knows it happened, is that I have seen a very high-ranking member of the Republican leadership in the Senate sit in the White House across the table from the President of the United States with my budget in his hand, lay it down on the table and say, "Mr. President, I think what young man done here is very interesting. I think it's fabulous. Let me tell you one thing, Mr. President. Not a single person in this town has ever lost their job for spending too much money. It's a Republican member of leadership. Okay? Can't tell you the number of times I had Republicans call me on the phone and shake me down for money. My favorite stories is OMB used to have the last earmark because we formalized the Army Corps of Engineer work plan. And so port deepenings and widenings and bridges and that kind of stuff, we had a great deal of impact in that. And I was in Saudi Arabia one night when a senator called me on the phone from D.C. and he says, "Oh, Mr. Director, it's so-and-so and so-and-so." I tell you, it was Johnny Isaacson. And Johnny Isaacson, I can say that now because he's dead and he can't go to jail. He said, "My staff tells me that I'm the swing vote on your boy tomorrow for your deputy position, Mr. Vote." "Yes, sir, Mr." What I wanted to say was, "Yes, sir, Senator, when you have a 50-50 sort of Senate, everybody's the swing vote, but what can I do for you?" "Well, I think I'm going to need a little money for that port down there in Savannah before I can bring him up for a vote. You know what I'm talking about?" And I said, "I've had these conversations before, Mr. Senator. I know it's a felony, but that's okay. What would you like to do?" He says, "Well, I'm going to need about $100 million for that port." "Okay. Let me get back to you, Senator. Thank you for calling." I call back to the office. Guy picks up the phone who handles the Army Corps of Engineers for me, and I said, "Hey, what have we got in the budget for the port down in Savannah?" He says, he goes, "Give me a second." He flips through. He goes, "We got $128 million. I says, "Okay. Make it 100 and call Johnny Isaacson's office and tell him you gave him exactly what he asked for." So, yeah. But listen, Nikki Haley is getting a lot of traction saying something I've said for 15 years, which is you don't get $32 trillion in debt because one party's sticking it to you. Both parties have held hands and they've gone down this road. What they've figured out, if you look at the GDP, the debt as a percentage of GDP, it's roughly the same from 1950 to 1980, and that's where it starts going like this. Okay? And what they figured out, what Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan figured out, because Ronald Reagan was president in 1981, was that everybody could have their own way. Republicans could cut taxes, and Democrats could spend more, and that was the trade-off, because they could just borrow the money, and that's what we've done ever since. The current situation is this. The current sort of unholy alliance is between the neoconservative right and the sort of center progressive left, or left progressive left, which is this. The right wants a lot more money for defense, and the left wants a lot more money for social welfare programs. And so whenever the Republicans are in charge, they get $6 more of defense spending, and the Democrats get $4 more of welfare spending. And when it's flipped, they get $6 more of welfare spending, and we get $4 more worth of defense spending. Because again, you have to have bipartisanship typically in the Senate to vote. So you got to pick up those votes. So how do people say, "Oh, why want we more bipartisan in Washington D.C.?" The most expensive thing in Washington D.C. is bipartisanship, because the only thing that we can agree on is spending more money. Okay, you'll never get everybody to agree on spending less. You can always get enough people to agree on spending more. So. I learned a valuable lesson. I was OMB, the best job I've ever had in my entire life. Aside from taking care of my dad in his last 6 months as he was dying, the best job I've ever had in my entire life was the OMB director. And one of the things you get to do in the OMB director is you get to go through the budget line by line. And when you're a geek, and I am, you get this is Christmas Day for 6 weeks, and you're doing 12 hours a day, line by line, and you've got a room like this. You're sitting at a huge table, and you get to do this. Okay, what is that? Okay, what is that? What is that? What is that? And the people who know the answers are sitting there and say, "Well, that's thus and such, and that's thus and such." Okay. What is that? "Oh, that's Superstorm Sandy money." That was a $60 billion appropriation in 2011. So, yeah. There's $28 billion on the budget. Yeah, well, we haven't spent it yet. I'm sorry, what? We'd only spent about 40% of the Superstorm Sandy money 5 years later, 6 years later. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Seriously? They haven't spent any of this money? It is a welfare program for the state of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut for as long as we can imagine, right? And I'm losing my time and say, "Well, Mr. Director, then you really don't want to know what the next line is." I said, "What's the next line?" The next line is Katrina money that we haven't spent yet. So anyway, yeah, that's why are we $32 trillion in debt? Because Republicans like spending money too. I don't have the microphone, so
I would love to know, because you are so bright and have experience.
I feel a butt coming on in this question.
I'm trying to soup you up and get you off your guard. But do you think there is a solution for this? It's the same problem I bump into with my own family. My wife died 8 years ago. I have 6 children from the age of 55 to 70. I'm 92. And just when we spent 2 weeks together in Maine on a vacation, did a lot of eruptions evolve. And I think some of my children said, "You're so stupid," or something like that. And that wasn't very civil. And I didn't want that to spoil our love. So I said, when I was a little kid, I promise I'll talk only another 40 seconds. When I was a little kid, I was brought up not to ruffle feathers. And that caused me to want to fit in. And now that I am 92, I don't like fitting in anymore. Although my clothes are the same ones I wore when I was 40 years old. But I said to the children, let's adopt kind of a philosophy of it's fun to fight. And after we get through fighting, then we can undertake other mutual activities. I am mumbling now. Maybe you can read my mind.
No, you're not. And it made me think of something that, thank you, because it's important that the younger folks hear this. As broken as you think Washington is, it's not nearly that broken. Right? There's a rule in the media business that television doesn't cover an airplane when it lands normally because it doesn't make news. They only cover the crashes, right? Bipartisanship doesn't sell. People getting along doesn't sell. Okay? No one tunes in to MSNBC to hear what a great guy Peter Welch thinks that I am, and no one turns into Fox to listen to have me say what a great guy I think Peter Welch is. Okay? I used to be friends with Barney Frank. It was a great story, by the way. So Barney one time says, we were talking about what he was going to do after he retires, and he tells me, and he goes, now Mick, I'm going to leave. I can't do the accent when I'm sober. But he goes, you need to remember when I'm gone, what's the biggest lie in Washington, D.C.? I said, I don't know, Barney. There's a lot of them. What's the biggest lie? The biggest lie is, I hate to say I told you so. Everybody loves saying that. So anyway, for a while, right after 2011, when I first got to Congress, I was on the floor, I was in the Budget Committee, and I was debating Christopher Van Hollen. He was the ranking member, the highest ranking Democrat on the committee at the time. Paul Ryan was our committeeman, our chairman. He let me debate against Van Hollen because Van Hollen knows his stuff, I knew my stuff. And we got into a very acrimonious debate on the floor. That video, for a short period of time, became sort of the poster child for what's broken in Washington, as we sat there for half an hour and yelled at each other on the floor of the House, okay? And they were, oh, this is terrible, you know. What they didn't cover is that not only did we go to dinner after that, okay, we remain friends to this day. He actually recommended me to the Trump administration for the job of OMB director because he knew the work I had done on the committee. Now, the epilogue to that is when I had to go through my Senate confirmation, and I went to go see him, sit in his office, and I knew he had recommended me. He started to vote. He goes, Mick, listen, I think you'd be great. You know I can't vote for you. I said, yeah, Chris, that's fine. So, so you don't see the whole story when you watch the news. And it goes back to the question that you asked about, are we doomed? I don't think so. But one of the challenges you're going to face is getting good information. How do you know what the truth is? By the way, it's one of the biggest things that worries me about AI. Is because now they're going to be able to, we think they'll be able to come out with stuff for AI that you can't tell is false because it's going to be so well documented with other stuff that's false. So this idea of knowing what's true is going to be a real challenge. But it's not, what you said to your family is how a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. work. I don't think Matt Gaetz is like that. I don't think Nancy Pelosi is like that. But there's a lot of folks who really like to mix it up. They like to yell and scream and have fun and debate. Debate's a lot of, listen, there's a reason. I mean, you're a member of the political union here, right? I mean, I got in some wonderful screaming matches at Cambridge with some folks that I'm friends with, young people. We went to go drink beer in the bar afterwards. That makes you better, right? There's a saying that says steel hardens steel. One of the things that Donald Trump did really well and did not do well is he used to manage by division, okay? And what he would do is he'd get two really smart people or two smart groups of people in the room, say on trade, tariffs versus free trade, okay? And on this side we have Gary Cohn and Stephen Mnuchin, you know, former president of Goldman Sachs. Stephen was a movie producer, was also Goldman Sachs. And on this side you had, you know, Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative. These are really, really smart people beating it out in front of the president. And if you get really smart people to do that, you can get really good decisions because you can see well, this, I like this from this, I like this, and you can cobble together something that is really good. Okay? With the president, that's what you're trying to get your family to do is, you know, just let's have it out. At the end of the day, let's go have dinner together. What the president changed at the end was that he didn't want to have that anymore. He just had this side of the argument. So it'd be sort of like you saying to your children, I'm only going to hang out with these three from here on out. And you other ones, you know, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. That would be a real problem. By the way, on that point, I tell people, they ask me, what went wrong with Trump? And I describe it this way. We began the administration with a senior circle being the president of Goldman Sachs and the former CEO of ExxonMobil. And we ended the administration with the guy who sells pillows on television. And that is the God's honest truth. That was the internal. And so was Peter Navarro, who used to work for me, who just got convicted. Peter actually got caught by the New York Times making up his academic sources for some of his papers. He was citing a Harvard economist named Ron Vara. New York Times calls me and says, we're going to run a story tomorrow. It says, Peter, this is not a real person. This is a made-up person. Do you want to comment? I said, no, but what the hell is going on? And they told me the whole story. And I called Peter and I said, Peter, what? He said, oh, they finally found out. I wonder how long it would take them to figure that out. Like, are you serious? He goes, yeah, Ron Vara. It's an anagram of my last name, Navarro. I can't believe it took him that long to figure that out. These were the inner circle. These are the people advising the people on things like the Insurrection Act. I'll give you one more, okay? You wanted a story? I'll give you a story. I'm down in the Lee County, South Carolina, a rural place that I used to represent, and a friend of mine ran the women's club down there, Republican club. She needed a speaker for her annual fundraiser. I come in and I speak. And as I leave, she walks up and she says, do you know who Lynn Wood is? I said, yeah, I know who Lynn Wood is. Why? He said, well, he was just here last month because he's campaigning for the state party chair, and he said some really bizarre things. And I said, what did he say? And she showed me the YouTube clip. You can find this, by the way, on YouTube. Lynn Wood, Insurrection Act, I think is the Google that you have to run. He got asked a question about, you know, Mr. Wood, I'm so afraid of Joe Biden being in office and so forth. Are you taping the whole thing? Okay, all right. That's fine. I just wish you had said something beforehand. So, okay, that's fine. He said, I'm really worried with Joe Biden being in office. And he says, madam, don't you worry. Because I'm going to tell you something that will make you feel much better. I was in the Oval Office with Donald J. Trump in the last hours of his first term, and I saw him sign the Insurrection Act. He is still the President of the United States. I know it. He knows it. Now you know it. But more importantly, the military knows it. He still has the nuclear codes. And the military knows that if we have something with China or something with Iraq, they're not supposed to call Joe Biden. They will call Donald Trump because he is still the President of the United States. Okay? That was a senior advisor to the President in the last days in the run-up to January 6th. So you asked me what went wrong. There you go. I hope your family works it out. All I can tell you is that when you and I were younger, I don't remember those conversations around the dinner table, so it's not part of being an American that we can't change. So you could also just decide not to talk about politics if you don't want to. One of the keys, by the way, the reason that Peter Welch and I are such good friends is that we discovered early on, and Joe Kennedy the same, I mentioned to you, we disagree about 90% of the time. We just don't talk about the shit we don't agree on. We might a little bit every now and then. You have a good conversation on a bill that's coming up. But I don't walk up to Joe every day and say, hey, Joe, how you doing? You know, your position on abortion is really awful. That's not the conversation. It's Joe. Listen, I thought you gave a really good presentation yesterday on that social welfare bill. That was pretty good. I mean, that's common sense, isn't it? You get along better with people if you can find something you agree on, disagree. I don't know how you want to do this.
Well, with
So,
that, I
yeah,
hope you all
all right.
join me in thanking Mr.
All right.
Mulvaney.